My name is Fatima, and I turned 45 this year. Since our only son left for college in another town, the house feels spacious with just me and my husband. We live in a custom-built 5-bedroom home that my husband and I thoughtfully designed to accommodate our child as he grew up. My favorite spot is the balcony, where I grow a variety of herbs, including chamomile, lavender, basil, rosemary, and mint. Freshly picked mint makes for a delightful mojito, and my son's favorite basil sauce is always included in his care packages. My husband insisted on having a study, so he designed a spacious workspace next to a custom-built shelf that reaches the ceiling, where he showcases his collection of books and video games. He often spends entire weekends in his study, engrossed in his favorite activities, taking breaks only for meals and bathroom visits. Meanwhile, I enjoy my weekends binge-watching dramas and movies in the living room, tending to my home garden, and relaxing now that the hectic days of raising children have passed. The mortgage for our home, which initially seemed overwhelming, was largely paid off with my income. I returned to work part-time after my son turned 1 and started full-time when he became more independent. Now that the hard work of raising children is behind us, my job and home gardening have become my passions. But our peaceful routine took an unexpected turn when my husband told me we were selling our house to my brother's family. His sudden decision left me bewildered. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. He explained that his brother's family had been living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with their 3 children, and that he wanted to help them by giving them our house. I couldn't believe he made such a major decision without discussing it with me. My husband's expression hardened as he asked, "Don't you want to help your family? It's normal to support them when they're in trouble." I agreed with the importance of helping family but was shocked by his lack of consultation with me. "Where will we live?" I asked, struggling to process the situation. Despite my efforts to remain composed, my anger grew as my husband continued. "Do you have a problem with this? I'm the one who provides for us. You should just listen." I had known my husband had traditional views since we married, but this was the first time he imposed his opinion so forcefully. My brother-in-law and his wife had previously relied on us for help, often dropping their 3 children off with us to enjoy their own free time. My husband, who always welcomed them with a smile, rarely helped care for the children, preferring to stay locked away in his study. My nephews were also quite demanding. "Auntie, can we eat out? We're tired of the same food at home," they would often say. "I want a hamburger, Auntie," my niece cried, her brother and sister nodding in agreement. "Mama and Papa said that you and Uncle are so kind. You'll give us whatever we ask for." It was no surprise the children behaved this way, given their parents' lenient attitude. My attempts to discuss the situation with my husband over the years seemed to fall on deaf ears, as he never took my concerns seriously. My son, who was in high school at the time, was equally frustrated with the situation. Our house became a dumping ground for my brother-in-law's children every weekend. Eventually, my son and I devised a plan to take on part-time jobs during weekends, so we wouldn't be available to watch the kids. My husband didn't want to handle the nephews on his own, so he began making excuses to avoid babysitting them. Though we had barely been in touch with my brother-in-law and his wife, I was taken aback when my husband abruptly announced we would be handing the house over to them. I felt lightheaded, trying to process this new reality. The next day, my brother-in-law's family visited, claiming they wanted to tour the house immediately. The nephews, now in junior high school, hadn't matured. They barged into the rooms that were apparently going to be theirs and began shouting excitedly, "We're moving in. This big house is too spacious for just 2 people. It's great that we'll live here now." My brother-in-law beamed, completely unconcerned about my shock. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law made herself at home in the kitchen, instructing me to thoroughly clean the house before handing it over to them. "It'll be a hassle if it's not done properly," she said matter-of-factly. Her audacity left me speechless, as if she already considered the house her own. I mentioned there's still a mortgage on this house, I said, hoping to shed light on the financial reality. But my brother-in-law just smiled, dismissing the concern. "That's okay," he replied confidently. "When our eldest starts high school next year, my wife will work part-time. She'll cover the mortgage, no problem." Listening to their conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling of misunderstanding. I had been covering the $1,200 monthly mortgage payments since the beginning. As a pharmacist, I had a decent income, but it was still a stretch. Meanwhile, My husband had informed me that my brother-in-law's monthly income was around $1,300, hardly enough to cover the mortgage. It seemed my brother-in-law and his wife assumed I had a lower-paying job, underestimating the financial burden. "You work at a pharmacy, right?" my brother-in-law asked casually. "That sounds cool. I'm studying to work at the Chica War myself. If I pass, we'll have another income." Their optimism bordered on naivety. My husband, always conscious of his ego, had apparently downplayed my income to others, implying I did office work at the pharmacy. This misconception led my brother-in-law and his wife to believe they could handle the mortgage themselves with both of them working. Suddenly, my brother-in-law asked about the monthly loan payment. The smile faded from my husband's face. He didn't know the exact amount we were paying each month. Without missing a beat, I replied, "It's $1,200. The reality of our financial situation hung heavy in the air. I blurted out the truth about the mortgage, and my husband, brother-in-law, and sister-in-law all froze in shock. "You must be joking, right?" my sister-in-law murmured, barely able to process the information. "No, I'm not joking. Since we didn't make a down payment, we're paying $1,200 each month for both the land and the building." My sister-in-law turned pale and screamed, "We can't pay $1,200 a month." I expected that reaction, thinking this would end the conversation. But then my brother-in-law began shouting at my husband, "What's going on? You never mentioned this. Are you expecting us to pay that amount?" My husband, flustered, turned to me and quietly asked, "Aren't you making prepayments? Are you still paying that much every month?" I explained that I only made additional payments twice a year during the bonus months, and we still had 15 years left on the 35-year loan. As my brother-in-law and sister-in-law stared at me, stunned by the unexpected reality, I hoped they would back out of their plans. But then my husband made a surprising statement: "We'll continue paying the loan." "How about that?" Stunned and in disbelief, I turned pale while my brother-in-law and sister-in-law erupted in joy. They praised my husband, saying, "I knew you were generous." I raised my voice, protesting against my husband's decision. "Wait a minute. What are you thinking? Why should we be the ones to do that?" My husband responded with his usual line. "What are you talking about? Our family is in trouble, and we should help them. How heartless can you be?" I was dumbfounded and fell silent. I couldn't endure my husband's thoughtlessness any longer. His eagerness to be seen as a kind and generous brother had pushed him too far. Pleased with my husband's offer, my brother-in-law and his wife continued their house tour. "We'll move in at the beginning of next month. Please make the necessary arrangements by then, such as updating the house registration and organizing the move." It was clear my husband expected me to handle all the changes, but I had reached my limit. That night, I called my son, who was living elsewhere, to update him on the situation. I told him I had finally reached my breaking point, and he laughed on the other end. "Good for you, Mom. It's time you stood up to them. Even if you decide on a divorce, you'll be just fine." My son's encouragement gave me the strength to teach my self-centered husband, along with my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, a lesson. After my husband's hasty decision to give the house away, I immediately consulted with the bank about my options. Upon researching, I learned it was nearly impossible to transfer the mortgage to my brother-in-law and his wife. Name changes on mortgages are typically between spouses or parents and children, but changes involving relatives complicate matters. Since I was the registered owner of the house, attempting to transfer the mortgage could violate the contract and result in immediate repayment of the remaining loan. Despite my husband's ignorance of these risks, he persisted in his plan to give the house away without careful thought. Meanwhile, I focused on work and housework, doing nothing to prepare for the handover. When the day approached, my husband was furious at the lack of progress. "What have you been doing all this time?" he demanded. "It's almost time for the handover, and you haven't even hired a moving company. I'm busy with work, so why don't you handle it yourself? Where will we live if we give away this house? Shouldn't that be a priority?" I countered, "If you're so concerned, you should handle it. I'm busy too." My husband fell silent, unable to respond. Every day followed the same frustrating pattern, and one day my husband reached his breaking point. A large number of cardboard boxes were delivered to the house. "I've arranged the move and secured a new apartment for us," he announced. "Stop sulking and start packing." I refused to pack from that day on, leading to repeated arguments. My husband would raise his voice and confront me every time. Stop being so irresponsible. Why are you so selfish? I'm sick of your attitude. If this continues, I'm getting a divorce. You don't want that, do you? Despite his threats, I continued to ignore him. The next day, my husband handed me the divorce papers, insisting he was serious. I'll forgive you if you start packing now. His audacity stunned me into silence. Instead of reacting, I signed and stamped the papers without hesitation and handed them back to him. My unexpected compliance sent my husband into a panic. You can't be serious. This must be a joke, right? He stammered. But I knew he wasn't truly considering divorce. I couldn't stay with someone who treated such a serious matter as a joke. Leaving the completed divorce papers on the table, I walked out of the living room. My husband's demeanor shifted. He became quiet and apologetic. Wait, I'm sorry. I don't want a divorce. I want to be with you forever, he said through tears. His sudden change of heart surprised me, but I calmly explained, I understand, but I'm not leaving this house, and I'm not changing the name on the mortgage. We can live together here, but you need to respect my decisions. My husband seemed to grasp my perspective, though his disappointment was evident. I can't tell my brother it's too late now. We can't live here, my husband said, his voice heavy with regret. Leave it to me, I assured my dejected husband, offering a comforting pat on his shoulder. The day of the handover arrived, and my brother-in-law and his wife arrived with a moving van borrowed from a friend, loaded with furniture and luggage. Since it was a weekday, their children were at school. Finally, this place will be our home. No mortgage payments, it's perfect, they exclaimed, standing triumphantly at the entrance. I stepped in front of them, blocking their path. I'm sorry, but there are conditions you need to meet if you want this house, I declared, showing them the mortgage documents I held. As stated here, the mortgage can't be transferred to you. If you still want to live here, you'll have to pay off the remaining loan amount in one lump sum. My assertive tone startled my brother-in-law, causing him to shrink back. But my sister-in-law responded sharply. Why are you interfering? Get out of the way. This is our house, she yelled. I showed them the documents again. I'm interfering because this house was bought under my name, I stated firmly, pointing to my name on the document. This house is mine. My husband has no authority over it. As the registered owner, I can't vacate it, so please leave. I hinted that I would involve the police if necessary, and my sister-in-law responded with indignation. Just because you have a good income, you think you're better than us. Don't you care about helping family? How heartless. I replied, yes, I'm fine with being seen as heartless. You need to stop relying on us and learn to live independently. Can you imagine your children seeing you act this way? I turned and closed the front door behind me, locking it securely. Despite their commotion outside, the glares of the neighbors eventually drove them away. After they left, my husband received a phone call from his brother, asking if they could stay at our place since they had already sold their old apartment. My husband glanced at me briefly and declined politely. I couldn't help but laugh at his decision. Letting them stay would mean they'd likely never leave, and my husband knew he had to follow my wishes if he wanted to avoid divorce. From that day on, my brother-in-law called my husband almost daily, and sometimes my sister-in-law would call in tears, but my husband stood firm in his refusals. I'm starting to feel a little sorry for my brother-in-law and his family, as they seem to be struggling financially and unable to rent a new apartment. My husband looked at me with a hopeful expression, trying to imply that I lacked compassion. So I suggested, what about the apartment we were planning to move into? Why not let them stay there? My husband's eyes lit up as he remembered the apartment and called his brother immediately. My brother-in-law's family moved into the apartment contracted by my husband a few days later, and I thought the ordeal was finally over. Unfortunately, another issue arose. My brother and his wife aren't paying the rent for the apartment, my husband confessed. I've been covering it for months because they promised to transfer the funds, but they never do. I wasn't surprised by their actions, knowing their track record. Since the apartment was in my husband's name, I anticipated they might take advantage of the situation. My suggestion to let them use the apartment was proving to be a poor decision. Looks like your family is having a tough time, I said with a sarcastic smile. Since you're not as cold-hearted as me, you'll surely continue to help them, right? My husband stayed silent, unable to respond. My brother-in-law's family struggled to pay the rent, eventually moving into a smaller one-bedroom apartment, which is now crowded with all 5 of them. While I do feel for my nephews, I believe this situation serves as a valuable lesson for their parents, who were accustomed to always getting their way. As for me, I'm eagerly waiting for the pressure to catch up with my brother-in-law and his wife, causing their stress to explode. I have no sympathy for them, as they have been quick to criticize me and call me cold-hearted. Despite their continued requests for money and the resulting debt my husband has incurred, I'm grateful we didn't have a joint savings account. Amidst the unrepentant behavior of my brother-in-law and his wife, and my husband's attempts to maintain a good relationship with them, I'm focused on my happy life, gardening and picking herbs for my son when he comes home.